Good morning to all our distinguished guests. My name is Patrick Pease. I'm the head of the Department of Geography, and I get the distinct honor of starting things off this morning. So I want to welcome you to University of Northern Iowa and the Arctic Horizons Workshop. The next 3 days promises to be exciting for you, and I know it will be transformative for the field of Arctic research. The theme of the workshop is Arctic social science in the 21st century, which highlights the importance of social scientists in creating a truly comprehensive understanding of the Arctic landscape. The recognition of authority of indigenous voices and knowledge in shaping the future of the Arctic is a critical component to understanding the Arctic itself. The Department of Geography and UNI are pleased to support this workshop, and we're proud to have Dr. Andrei Petrov as one of our faculty members. Dr. Petrov possesses a prodigious energy, boundless curiosity, and a deep respect for the people and cultures of the Arctic. And I thank him for his outstanding service to the field and for his amazing work in making this workshop happen. I also thank Ann Crawford and many of our outstanding geography graduate students who worked tirelessly to bring this together. On behalf of the department and the university, I invite you to make UNI your home for the next few days. Don't hesitate to ask any of our students, faculty, or staff for anything that you need. We're here to help you be as productive as you can be for the next few days. Lastly, it is my pleasure to introduce President William Root. Dr. Root is the 10th president of UNI and a strong supporter of the very kinds of academic pursuits and social change that you will undertake in this workshop. Dr. Root is a passionate advocate of diversity and the inclusion of all voices, and has set a tone at our university that is befitting the themes of this meeting. And I also want to point out that he is my favorite president. So please join me in welcoming President Root.
Okay, Patrick, $5,000 you need for the geography department's yours. All right. Okay. Welcome all, and before I give my remarks, I just want to, for those of you who have never been in this room, this is the original library of the University of Northern Iowa. When this university was founded back in 1876, this is one of the original buildings. There were 3 buildings: Searly Hall, Old Main, and then the original college, Iowa State Teachers College, which is now Lang Hall. And the murals are up on the abound here, and if you look back in the far corner, there's a portrait of the namesake of this building, Homer Searly. He was the longest-serving president of the University of Northern Iowa, and that is actually his desk and his file cabinet from the early 1900s. He was the president here for 42 years. So Homer Searly has a great memory in this room, and this room is a room that only recently we have updated a little bit and been able to use for events like this. We use it for receptions, we use it for activities, and befitting to the university, it's a room that we need to use more. So, Andre, the room is always available. Good morning again. Welcome all to the University of Northern Iowa, and we are extremely pleased to host the Arctic Horizons Workshop. We welcome you to our campus. We welcome you to Cedar Falls, Waterloo. We welcome you to the state of Iowa. I, too, encourage you. We ordered up good weather for you. So the weather is perfect for walking around. Lots of things to do in and around campus. There's a little piece of campus up over here called The Hill. Coffee shop, restaurants, so please enjoy. UNI has an early connection to polar research, as one of our alumna, Dorothy Jean Ray, was a prominent expert and champion of the art and culture of Native Alaskans. UNI is an emerging leader in polar sciences and honored to be one of the 5 locations in the nation where the future of Arctic social sciences is and will be discussed. And of course, we are honored to be the home of the Arctic Center, which serves as a focal point of UNI and faculty involvement in polar research. The fundamental and applied research conducted at UNI greatly benefits this state, the nation, and the world. The Arctic Center also brings together scholars, as are in this room, from various disciplines, to address in an interdisciplinary manner the complex questions of human development, climate change, and of course, sustainability. As a university, we're proud of our strengths in the social sciences and education, and we are especially excited to host so many anthropologists, archaeologists, human geographers, sociologists, historians, economists, and political science. And you have near and dear in my heart, my discipline is organizational behavior out of the College of Business, which of course has its roots in sociology, anthropology, and psychology. In addition, we are especially thrilled to welcome indigenous scholars. Integrating traditional knowledge and scientific discovery is one of the key tasks on our way to understanding the complexities of environmental and societal change in the Arctic and around the world. Another important aspect of UNI is that we have a growing Native American population. We are deeply committed to diversity and multiculturalism within our faculty, within our student body, and within our curriculum. In fact, colleagues within our College of Social and Behavioral Sciences are working to establish a certificate in Native American and Indigenous Studies. And speaking of students, I'm happy to see students and early career scholars in the audience today. There's no doubt that you will be future leaders in the Arctic sciences. Over the last few years, many UNI students have worked in northern Canada and Russia, in Alaska, and in Iceland on various National Science Foundation research projects, earning valuable professional and academic experiences. We are very, very proud of their success. It is now my pleasure to introduce our own young Indigenous Arctic researcher, a geography master's student, Ms. Varvara Korkina, who will welcome you on behalf of the Arctic Center, UNI students, and all UNI polar researchers. Thank you very much for coming. Varvara. Now, before she starts, I have to comment. Varvara, show them the paper that you're reading from in your presentation. Show them what you're reading from. The generations have presented themselves. Varvara, all yours.
Thank you, President Ruth. Good morning, dear colleagues. I would like to greet you on behalf of UNI Arctic Center and on behalf of Arctic Youth. My name is Varvara Korkina, and I am a member of indigenous commanding people living in Siberia. I'm also a graduate student and research assistant in the Arctic Center, University of Northern Iowa. As an indigenous youth activist, I devoted my life and career to defending and promoting indigenous rights, cultures, and young people in Russia and around the globe. Arctic is always looked upon in the global context. This is climate change, resource extraction, new transportation routes, and changing geopolitics. However, to Arctic social scientists as well as to indigenous people, it is clear that the Arctic is not only the world's treasure chest, but it is our home. Indigenous people in the Arctic, albeit very resilient, are most vulnerable to all global challenges. We are the ones who are most affected by broken promises on natural hazards. But we also have internal issues which we must face and address ourselves. One of the main challenges is the status and future of the Arctic youth. What should we do? What do we want? Will it be a true sustainable development for indigenous people and is inclusive of the young people? If yes, what do we need to move in this direction? There are many questions we need to be answered. However, the most important is that we have to answer to these questions ourselves, working together with social scientists. To achieve this, we first of all need to invest in education. Educated, creative, and active youth can make a difference in improving the condition of our communities. Only through establishing close and respectful collaboration between scientists, indigenous people, and policymakers, we can ascertain optimal and sustainable development that preserves our land, strengthens our communities, and allows continuation and development of our culture. Using our own and scientist knowledge, we will be able to capitalize on both to turn the situation around. I am grateful to the University of Northern Iowa, to President Root, and to the National Science Foundation that you support our Arctic Center. We are proud to host such an important workshop in our walls and happy to welcome such a diverse group of social scientists on campus. I hope you will enjoy your stay and we will be productive in our work. Thank you very much and welcome.
Well, thank you everyone for nice welcoming remark. Now it's me, and it's turning boring. So I guess we a little bit ahead of schedule, aren't we? What happened with the screen? Yeah, let's fix that first.
On the Zoom.
Which one? Actually, either one. Yeah, either first or second, they would have the same thing. Okay. All right, maybe. So, I guess what we start with, my name is Andrei Petrov, and I guess what's in our schedule is introductions. Yesterday some of us had a chance to meet and talk, and some of us didn't. So I think it would be worthwhile for us to go through the classroom exercise of introducing ourselves and saying, I understand people read the biographies, but sometimes you have to hold, the picture and say, oh, this must be. And normally in this room, whenever we speak, we have to use microphone. I guess we could do that as well. So Anna, the most important part is Anna hears us, and she is somewhere in this room. Well, I guess, and she will tell you, of course, herself. She will tell you yourself what happened. She couldn't make it here, but she's with us. She's with us. She's watching us. This is quite interesting. So just keep in mind that she's here. So I guess what I'll do, I'll just start quickly with myself. So I'm Andrei Petrov, as you heard from various people. And I'm a director of the Arctic Center, which is not just actually Arctic, it's Arctic Remote and Cold Territories Interdisciplinary Center that was established here at UNI. Actually, officially, we only were established last year, Board of Regents, but I'm grateful to Iowans for supporting this important effort. But we've been doing Arctic work for a long time here, and most of it is social systems. I'm a human geographer. So then I guess we would probably start with Peter and just pass the mic around.
Thank you, Andrei. My name is Peter Pulsifer. I'm with the University of Colorado at Boulder and the National Snow and Ice Data Center. And I am actually started out as a geographic information scientist, but I sort of cross between that and I think cultural geography now. And I lead a project called ALOCA, or the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Olaf Kalki. I'm at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, Arctic Duluth. Still winter up there. I'm a human geographer, and for the last 14 years, I've mostly done research in the area of youth cultures and also on the creative economy. And I'm specifically interested in economic development through the arts and culture in northern locations.
Hello, I'm Dixie West. I'm at the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum. I'm an archaeologist, and for the past 20 years I've been working in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. It's an interdisciplinary groups of people that we go out and we excavate, we study climate, we study the biology, we study the human factors of the Aleutian Islands. And I want to say thank you very much to Anna Kurtula for our most recent research in the islands of the Four Mountains of the Aleutians.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Zanotti. I'm at Purdue University with the Department of Anthropology, the Center for the Environment, and the American Studies program. My work centers on building sustainable communities. So what that means is partnering with local communities on different aspects of resilience, rights, leadership, and most recently, digital activism. Thanks.
I'm Lenore Grenoble. I am a linguist at the University of Chicago, and I also hold an appointment at the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth, where I was for many years before I went to Chicago. By training, I'm a Slavic linguist, and I've been working on Evenki for maybe 20 years, and I also do field work in Greenland, where I work on Kalaallisut, and I'm very interested in language endangerment, so I've been working closely over the last few years with the permanent participants of the Arctic Council.
My name is Peter Schweitzer, University of Vienna and University of Alaska Fairbanks, and you will be hearing from me in a minute, so I will pass on the mic.
Good morning. My name is Liesl Ritchie. I'm the Associate Director at the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I did my dissertation research in Cordova, Alaska, looking at the long-term impacts of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and I have ongoing research looking at technological hazards and disasters and their social impacts down in the Gulf, in Tennessee, looking at the TVA coal ash spill from a few years ago, among other nasty, toxic contamination events.
Good morning. My name is Dwayne Gill. I am a sociologist from Oklahoma State University. I've just recently been named the director of the Center for the Study of Disasters and Extreme Events at Oklahoma State. And I've done work in Alaska with the Exxon Valdez, the Sounding IU shipwreck and oil spill, and some work in Kodiak looking for tsunami preparedness.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Shauna Burns-Silver. I'm an environmental anthropologist in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. I'm also a senior sustainability scientist in the School of Sustainability there. I started out work in East and West Africa looking at issues of land transformation, land rights, and livelihood diversification, and then I made the jump to the Arctic and have concentrated on work in northern Alaska for the last 5 years. My interests there are in the mixed economy and how social relationships and sharing and cooperation really allow people to adapt, maybe not adapt, but adjust and cope to some of the really dramatic changes that they're dealing with.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Colleen Strawhecker. I'm at the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado. I refer to myself there as a hybrid, although I have a feeling a lot of us can call ourselves hybrids at this point, but I'm both an archaeologist and also leading our efforts at NSIDC to manage and curate data from the social sciences in the Arctic.
Hi, I'm Catherine Catlin. I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern University in the anthropology department. My work is based in North Iceland, where I study the archaeology of abandoned medieval farming landscapes and settlements. I'm specifically looking at marginality, inequality, social change, and how all of that is tied into anthropogenic landscape and environmental change during the medieval period in Iceland. Thanks.
I thought I had the entire circle to prepare. So, my name's Lee Husky. I'm a emeritus professor of economics from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I've started studying. My focus of my work has been in Alaska, and then surprisingly, I realized I was studying the Arctic. But mostly, I looked at change and how it changes the structure of economic relationships in Alaska and in the small communities of Alaska.
My name is Herbert Maschner. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Virtualization and Applied Spatial Technologies at the University of South Florida, and a professor of both geosciences and anthropology split. I've spent the last 30 years working in various areas of the North Pacific and Bering Sea on a suite of topics from biocomplexity and the environment to catastrophic environmental change and long-term climate change and a number of other issues, mostly from the perspective of geospatial analysis, complex systems, networks, and a number of other topics.
Hi, I'm Alan Craig, and I'm with the National Science Foundation's funded Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment, which is the sort of the umbrella over the National Supercomputer Centers program. I'm located at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. And my role within that program is I'm the liaison for the, the name says science and engineering. I'm the liaison to the humanities, arts, and social sciences. And so via Anna Kurtula, I'm also involved in several Arctic projects, and my personal background is in visualization and virtual reality and augmented reality.
Good morning. My name is Bob Ortung, and I'm a political scientist at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And there, over the course of my career, I've worked on a lot of different aspects of Russian politics. And currently, with my colleagues in the geography department and sociologists, we're working on Russian Arctic urban sustainability. So not only Russian, but looking at how Arctic cities in Russia are sustainable or not, and then how that compares to the rest of the Arctic. So we're just getting started on that project.
Good morning. My name is Susie Crate, and I'm an anthropologist at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I've done ethnographic research since 1991 with Vilui Saha, who are along the Vilui River in western Saha Republic, northeastern Siberia, Russia. And then in the last 10 years, mostly focusing on perceptions, understandings, and responses to climate change, with a comparative project also in several communities, coastal communities in Nunatsivat, Labrador. Looking at now also, in addition to climate change, the other forces, a lot of what we're going to be talking about in these few days, the demographic shifts, young people leaving the settlements, and then the influences of economic globalization on local economies. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Beth Staub. I am a professor of sociology here at UNI, so I only get to be here for a little bit because I'm also department head. So I do a lot of work with ethnographic looks at women's creative handwork practices. I specifically look at gendered cultural production, why women make stuff. And so I'm looking at the US, Ireland, England, and Iceland is now my new focus. I'm understanding that how culture will disappear soon if we're not careful, and so how that works with handwork practices as well.
Hi, my name is Nicole Mazzardi. I'm at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I too am a bit of a hybrid. I started out my life as an archaeologist and finished it off as a marine scientist. But basically, I look at changing ecosystems over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, looking at resources that coastal communities in Alaska used both then and now, both subsistence and commercially. So that's what I'm doing. Oh, this way, this way.
Hi, I'm Melinda Lighturi. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm a geographer from Colorado State University, that other university in Colorado. I am also the director of the Geospatial Centroid at CSU. I do a lot of work with indigenous cultures, participatory mapping, and environmental justice.
Hi, I'm Gail Fondal. I'm a cultural geographer at the University of Northern British Columbia, and I'm interested in the legal geographies of indigenous territorial rights in Siberia. I guess that's among many, but right now the most, the greatest interest.
Good morning. My name's Nancy Maynard, and I'm a NASA emeritus scientist and also visiting scientist at the University of Miami. I was trained as a marine biologist and have sort of ricocheted over the years between straight marine biology and other sciences, and also policy and applied sciences. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been particularly interested in working with colleagues in the indigenous community, combining remote sensing and other science with indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge for solutions, and in particular with Samis in northern Norway.
Hi, I'm Virginia Hatfield. Feel free to call me Jenny. I'm an archaeologist. I've been working with Dixie West through the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute in the Aleutian Islands for the past 15 or so years. And we're currently working in the islands of the Four Mountains, as she mentioned, looking at human resilience and getting an idea of the occupation of these islands and how people and the ecosystem change through time.
Hello, I'm Mike Etnier. I'm a zooarchaeologist at Portland State University. I study primarily the biogeography and historical ecology of the prey species that people have been subsisting on for thousands of years. To do that, I do a little bit of field work myself, but primarily use legacy collections that other people have put in museums and stored for 5 to 80 years that are just collecting dust, but they're an amazing source of information. I've utilized collections that Dixie has excavated, that Herb and his team have excavated. I also have been working fairly closely with the Neotoma Paleoecological Database over the last 5 to 10 years to create an online archive of zooarchaeological data for the state of Alaska. And I'm on the steering committee for Arctic Horizons with Andre because I didn't have the good sense to say no thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Gordon. I'm a PhD student in Indigenous Studies at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I recently finished my master's in sociology from Madison, Wisconsin, and I interviewed Inuit Greenlanders and North American Arctic researchers about building relationships to work together in research. And my interest now that I'm working on proposing is looking at self-determination, fate control, and well-being, and how people see their futures in small rural communities. And I'm a Inupiaq, so I'm very interested in self-determination. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Josh Lynch. I'm a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University with the Center for the Study of the First Americans. My dissertation research relates to late Pleistocene, early Holocene occupations of interior Alaska and Siberia. I'm particularly interested in toolkit development and landscape learning, resource exploitation across Beringia.
Hi, my name is Jim Powell. I'm from Juneau, Alaska. I'm an assistant professor in the public administration program. I think I'm a social ecological scientist. I'll introduce myself that way. I started out 20 years in regulatory agencies in Alaska looking at water quality issues and wetlands, and then went back to school, got my PhD, and now I'm doing a lot of governance, adaptive capacity and governance systems in Alaska, mainly in Southeast Alaska, and then looking also at observations of climate change amongst the indigenous people there.
Good morning, my name is Tim Pash. I'm Associate Professor of Communication at the University of North Dakota. I'm a product of the Arctic Studies group at the University of Washington, where I completed my PhD in communication in 2008. For my dissertation work, I lived in Nunavik in Arctic Quebec with an Inuit family, so I studied Inuktitut under a FLAS grant, which I continue to work towards improving. It's a tricky language for me. So being at UND, I have great access to the central region of Nunavut, so I'm often in the Kirvalik region, working with Inuit communities in Arviat, primarily on digital development. So we've been looking at app development, working towards Inuktitut-based games for mental health and for building confidence and digital mobility in Nunavut. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jay Johnson. I'm from the University of Kansas, cultural geographer. I also direct the Center for Indigenous Research, Science, and Technology at KU, a pretty small research center. A lot of my research has been comparative Indigenous studies between communities in Australasia, other parts of the Pacific, and North America. And Anna is currently funding us to do work. I'm collaborating with a network of Indigenous researchers to build the capacity, research capacity in Indigenous communities across the U.S.
Good morning. My name is Joseph Brewer. I'm an assistant professor currently at the University of Kansas Environmental Studies Department. I work with and for American Indian tribes here in the lower 48 and with Alaska Natives, primarily on the Yukon Flats. Right now I'm working on a biomass project on the Yukon Flats in a little community called Fort Yukon. We're cutting and chipping cottonwood trees and we're sending them through a combined heating system to offset extraordinarily high diesel costs right now. Good morning, Anna.
I think maybe Anne can introduce herself as well, and the students on the back.
Hi. Well, I think a lot of you have met me already, and I welcome you here. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I work for the Arctic Center with Andre, and then I also work with another professor, Alex Oberle, with the Geographic Alliance of Iowa, which is supported by National Geographic. I also work with John DeGroat, who has the GeoTree Center in our geography department, and I handle the paperwork and kind of the logistics for our graduate students. So some days I'm pretty crazy, but hopefully I don't show it too much. You all received name tags, and some of you who I made some glitches in, I've got those corrected for you. So in the name tags, you'll have these little things that will tell you which table to be at for each discussion session. And then you'll also have a tan kind of piece of paper that will tell you your dinner assignments for each night. And you'll be going to different restaurants in assigned groups to kind of continue your getting to know each other and your collaboration. So we will try to make that transportation as seamless as possible, maybe. And then as far as I've handed you all reimbursement information, and I will be here at lunches both today and tomorrow, so if you want to just come back and talk to me personally about that, I think that might be the easiest way. But you'll have a sheet on the front that will just kind of highlight the expenses that you have and what you need to be reimbursed for, and then I will let you know what else we need. And if you're not sure if we reimburse it, please feel free to ask and I'll let you know. But pretty much we will cover most anything that you have expenses for coming out here. Thank you.
My name is Emily Francis, and I am a master's researcher here at the University of Northern Iowa, and Dr. Petrov is my advisor. And I study reindeer and spatiotemporal migration, specifically the Taimyr herd in Siberian Russia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Narmina Yusubova, and I'm a graduate student of University of Northern Iowa. My advisor as well is Andrei Nikolaevich, Petrov, and I study renewable energy in Arctic Russia region. And hello, everyone.
Hi, I'm Joel Heilman. I'm a master's student here as well in geography, and I also got my undergraduate here in geography.
Okay, thank you everyone, and of course, I'm not sure what, I hope they are enjoying themselves. You know, John Waterhouse and Mary Marshall hopefully will be here with us. Sure, I mean, they are in town, but I mean, they may be enjoying nice weather. Well, of course, we have Anna, who will introduce herself, and do we have Jessica at all? Because Jessica also supposed to be watching us today and join us tomorrow. So that's the idea. So before, I guess, I turn the table to Anna because she is coming in a few minutes. I just want you to look at our program and at the schedule and just kind of give a 1 minute brief overview what's going to happen, right? So we have several types of activities. There are plenaries like this, all right, that will be happening, and then most of it today and early tomorrow, there will be these breakout sessions for which you have these little tickets in your badges. So the idea is that we try to split you in a way that you don't sit with the same people every time or every other time, so hopefully it worked out. And the idea is that you discuss questions with different people. The questions, if you did not have a chance to look, the questions are on page 11. And for each of the sessions, there are 4 sessions and 4 questions. Each of them has 3 sub-questions. So that's what we will ask you to respond while doing that, which we'll discuss in a second, after Anna, how exactly we organize that. But that's the basic idea. And then we have several keynotes. I also should show you this slide, maybe. I don't know whether I'm entitled to it, but maybe Anna will talk a little bit about it. But this is technically the 4th workshop in the Arctic Horizons. However, it's the 2nd regional workshop. The 2 others in Fairbanks and Juneau were thematic workshops, right? So the first one was the wonderfully organized Portland workshop that we are trying to model after. And then, as I said, Fairbanks and Juneau workshop. Fairbanks was a workshop that focused on indigenous scholarship. Juneau workshop was focused on building relationships between social science and humanities in the Arctic. So our workshop is regional, so which is generic workshop in a sense that brings people from various backgrounds. However, we have our own topic as well, which is it's really focuses on data. We phrase it as theories, data, and methods to ascertain local, national, and international relevance. I'm not sure what I was thinking, but the idea is that we have a half-day data discussion tomorrow, and it's very important because social sciences data and what to do with it, what kind of data we collect, and how we manage it is very critical, especially for the next decade. What the social science should be doing. So I put it up also to tell you something that some people asked me yesterday. We will tell you, we will provide a briefing on what others' workshops said, but not in the beginning. We decided that we would sort of defer it until we actually had our own conversation. Kind of then we will hear from what others have said, so that we don't have preconceived notions. So I also would like to recognize what we call the regional/local organizing committee. Of course, there is you and I kind of sell for it, but what we try to do is to involve a larger committee. So I have Peter Pulsifer and Jay Johnson right there, who were looking at helping us with building the agenda and the program and all this important things. Jessica Graybill, as I said, she is supposed to be watching us, but she will join us tomorrow. And I told her, now you come and you will be running it, because I will be tired by that. So that is I guess important parts. I think that Anna will address general things about the workshop and our goals, so I will not be taking her time, and probably we could switch to her. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do now. Just leave? Okay.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Great. Let me say hi to everybody. Somebody tell me, or they'll send me a note if you're not hearing me properly. Am I coming on loud and clear? Just got rid of something that was on my face.
We can see you and hear you just great, Dana.
Great. Okay. First of all, let me say, wow, what a wonderfully diverse group. And thank you, Andre, for the great job you did of bringing this diverse group of scholars together. I'm particularly bummed that I can't be there, but I really appreciate you all putting up with me on the virtual screen. So I will be participating throughout the day, virtually. Certainly when you report from your sessions, I'll be listening in today, tomorrow, and on Saturday. I want to thank the University of Northern Iowa for their institutional support, and of course, Andre for agreeing to host this workshop, and probably more importantly, Ann Crawford for her great planning and organizing skills, and Emily and Joel, and I'm sorry, I think I heard Nadia. Forgive me if I got the name wrong. I'm particularly looking forward to proposals from Emily and Nadia eventually, so that's a little bit of a hint there and a little bit of a plug. We'll be talking in the future, I hope, about your own research and your goals in social sciences. So I want to also thank you all for participating. You can tell I'm reading my notes down here. For participating in this workshop, for giving your time to this workshop and to this effort. Andre talked just very briefly about what the Arctic Horizons process is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, I owe you all a huge apology. I think I even promised some people we'd have little side discussions, and I'm not there. And for that, I'm sad, because it's always greater and more invigorating to be able to participate in person. Hang on, my phone. But I'll be there as much as possible, listening to what everyone has to say. I do want to say that I don't think I need to talk too much about the National Science Foundation. I think most of you are very familiar with the National Science Foundation. But I do want to say that this is sort of your workshop. This is a chance to talk together, to meet each other. I think one of the best things that's been coming out of all the workshops is the networking that occurs. It's one of the reasons I'm very big on research coordination networks in my program, because it gives you all a chance to talk together and meet each other and think about new ideas and create new synergies. So I'm very excited about that aspect of this workshop. And then also, since you'll be talking about Arctic social science, about interdisciplinary research, and about your own interests, we're hoping to then mine that data, so to speak, about your online and offline conversations that are recorded, so that we can find out the ideas that maybe aren't discussed openly as well. What are we missing? What are people thinking about that we're missing, that this program doesn't seem to invite from the community? NSF likes to say we're community oriented. We like ideas to bubble up from the community. There's a lot of top down that goes on in creating solicitations that solicit your research. And so this was kind of Arctic Social Sciences and myself putting my money where my mouth is, or where NSF's mouth is, in saying we're really interested in the things you're thinking about. The last time we talked about that with the community in this program was in 1991, and it was one workshop with sort of the who's who in social sciences at the time. And so we're trying to make this a much more open process, a much broader process with more interdisciplinary participation in it. I'm not going to go through the history of the program. You all are probably pretty familiar. It started in 1990 with 3 themes: human environmental interactions and community viability and rapid social change, which is a pretty good group of concepts to start the program in 1990. These themes then grew into the 1999 document, which you all were asked to read, so I'm not going to repeat there. But as I've been telling every group, a lot has changed in the Arctic since this program was started, and not all of it is climate driven. We talk a lot about climate change, but you all in this room represent a lot of other themes and interests that certainly can be affected by climate, but is not climate driven. Globalization, if you're working in the area of historical trauma, you're looking at colonization, you're looking at missionization, you're looking at language loss for language vitality scholars, knowledge systems, traditional knowledge. A lot has changed in the Arctic that, although climate seems a very rapid and dramatic change that we anticipate will have dramatic effects on people's lives, it's not the only process that's happening. And as I keep telling my colleagues here at the National Science Foundation, changing climate ain't the biggest thing to have happened to Arctic peoples in the last 200 years. So I'm really thrilled to learn what your ideas are, what you think is going to happen. And Andre outlined the basics of what the Arctic Horizons workshops are about. Portland was one of the the Fairbanks workshop was focused primarily on Indigenous scholarship, and I want to talk just a little bit about that here. Because there's been some criticism leveled at the program for having focused one workshop, primarily Indigenous scholars participating. And I want to talk just briefly, because you may be having that feeling again now, about underrepresentation of Indigenous scholars at other workshops. And the Fairbanks workshop was Indigenous scholars that were funded through the program, and the workshop organizer, Stacy Rasmus, thought that it would be important to have a workshop of primarily focused on Indigenous scholars and primarily organized by and for Indigenous scholars. And I have to say that one of the elders that spoke at that workshop, Mr. Justin Wilson, he put it very nicely. He gave a wonderful keynote on Indigenous scholarship that was very complex and very high level. And he said one of the great things about the workshop was that he didn't have to educate a whole room of white folks as to where Indigenous scholarship was and what Indigenous scholars were thinking, that he could start knowing that most people in the room already understood exactly where he was coming from, and so he could get to his more complex concepts. Now, most of you work with Indigenous scholars, they work closely with Indigenous communities, et cetera. And so you're probably thinking, well, you know, we're already there, we understand all that. But I think there's a time and place for Indigenous scholars to talk and to think about these concepts themselves, and to be able to assume that everybody in the room comes from a similar background and place where they are. And I think that the Fairbanks workshop was extremely productive. Was not an attempt to isolate Indigenous scholars from everybody else. But I also think that it's not the responsibility of Indigenous scholars to educate necessarily the broader social science and natural science community. And so I think those that attended the Fairbanks workshop felt that it did exactly what they hoped it would do. And that was the purpose of holding the Fairbanks workshop and focusing on Indigenous scholarship. So if there's criticism, it's to me, and I'm happy to take it and listen to it. But also, I don't feel the need to explain myself, even though I'm sitting here explaining. I don't feel defensive at all. I think that it was a really important workshop to take place. And I just want you all to understand where that workshop was coming from and where the Indigenous scholars who organized that workshop were coming from, so that you don't feel that we're purposefully isolating or excluding that scholarship from all of the workshops. So anyway, let's say, let me go on in my notes. I want to, let me just mention briefly the Juno workshop, which was on synergies between social science, art, humanities, and engineering. It was an extremely interesting workshop, and people talked about not only the sort of the how-to, but some of the theory behind that. I think it was a less structured and more discussion-oriented workshop than the other two. And I think that that was a good thing. And I think we'll learn a lot once we look at the tapes. And the Jefferson Institute, Aaron Presnell isn't with you, but Aaron Presnell of the Jefferson Institute is the one who's going to be actually researching the data coming from all the workshops. And I think there will be a lot in that workshop that the program that will probably be new to the program. I'm personally very interested in the intersection between humanities and science. I think we talk a lot about interdisciplinary science, but we're still kind of stovepiping, especially in this country, maybe less so in Europe, the humanities off to the side and not recognizing how rich and important humanities research is to the endeavor of science, that they're not mutually exclusive. Again, social scientists probably have a pretty good sense of that, because the humanities help us and arts help us understand who we are. And that's important to the social sciences, but I think it's important at the National Science Foundation that we not set humanities aside and say, oh, that's humanities research, go to the National Endowment for the Humanities. It has nothing to say to science. I think it has a lot to say to science. So that was part of the reason for the Juno workshop, was to bring that, those concepts forward. I think I see Jessica. Hi, okay. I get to see her, you guys don't. Anyway, I want to say that I think social science and the way social science is being done in the Arctic is also profoundly changing, and you all have been a very big part of that profound change. Community-based participatory research projects where you're working closely with the community and the community is working to help you design. Either you may be an Indigenous researcher or you may be a non-Indigenous researcher. Both of you came up through the academic system, and so I think it's important to return to the communities and find out what's interesting to them and work closely with them in designing research projects and research questions and in analyzing your data. I like that model a lot. It's not the only model, but it is a model that has been promoted and developed by you all, by people working in the science, have contributed greatly to that model. And I'm a big fan of that model. I think it works really well. But as I said, it's not the only model. That sometimes you may go into a community and say, I'm interested in doing this kind of work. What are you interested in? And they may say, yeah, okay, you're welcome to stay. You're welcome to ask questions. will provide a good place for you to work, but we're really not all that interested in that stuff. So, you know, make a report. We're interested in what you find, but the participation, we're just doing so many other things, and that's okay. But you need to, and you need to ask, and you need to find out, and if there is a way that you can contribute. These are all old ethics for doing social science in the Arctic, but they're really important ones, and I think in a lot of ways we've been a model for that, and so that's a small pat on the back. We need to do more, and not all of you are working in indigenous communities. Some of you are working in rural communities in Alaska or in other places in the Arctic that are not indigenous, but the same concept applies. Community-based research is important. So let me just float through. You don't want to hear this whole thing anyway. I'm just going to float through here. So I guess I'll say, and I'll leave some space for questions. I don't know how much time Andre gave me. I just want to say that this is your workshop. We really are listening. It's not just for me. Once the report is completed, it will be sent out broadly. One of the things missing in this workshop, and now we've been through 3, this is the 4th, is wider international participation. That was my fault. I got stingy with funding because my budget did take a rather large hit, which I think some of it's going to be replaced, and next year I think we'll be fine. But I tried to keep the budget down, and international participation is obviously quite expensive. And I think that what we're going to do, what I'm planning, and I talked to my boss, who was my old boss, is now going to be my new boss. It's been announced that Simon Stevenson is coming back, which is great for social sciences, because Simon frequently says to me, Anna, give me social science for a glaciologist, but he at least understands the importance and the critical role that social science plays in understanding the Arctic system as a whole. And so that's good news for us. And now I lost my train of thought. Woman with a brain over 50. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. I really appreciate your participation. I think there will be a broader conversation. I know what, here, I got it again. We're going to do this again next year. Probably in a different way. I'm dreaming of a Dear Colleague letter that solicits 6 to 10 workshops that will take place over an additional year, allowing more international participation or indigenous participation from across the Arctic, and additional regional. And then we'll have the information from these 6 workshops to feed into the types of questions and the types of documents that and discussions that you all will have. I think by the end of this year, we only have 1 more workshop to go. I mean, we've sort of been on a shakedown cruise, and the following year could be even more productive. So I think it was too much to ask that in a springtime, we could have discussions with the broad diversity of Arctic scholars that exists, which in the end, there will be about 250 participants, which is still a fraction of not only the Arctic social science community, but people who are interested in working on interdisciplinary scholarship in general. And so I think we need to continue for another year talking about these topics, and maybe sort of routinizing this in the Arctic social science program, so these workshops can continue bringing scholars together until you're all exhausted of talking about it. So that's my plan, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you now that I've blah, blah, blah on for longer than I was probably time allotted. Thank you.
No, Anna, you're actually doing very well with time. So questions. If we have any questions, we have at least 10, 15 minutes for questions. So anything?
Ooh, 15 minutes.
Well, 10, I would say. Any questions for Joanna? I mean, she's right there.
Anybody wondering why they're sitting there? Anna's master plan for Arctic social science?
Yes, well, I guess Susie could ask the question then.
I'm just encouraging you to answer your question for us all. We're all eager to hear your master plan for Arctic social science.
My master plan for Arctic social sciences is to give you all a stronger voice. I tell people I came here 15 years ago, and we've kind of been operating on Anna's plan for Arctic social science, and I'm really pleased to a lot of what we've accomplished. When I first came, increasing the diversity of underrepresented groups in Arctic social science was a huge part of my plan. Women were being funded at about 15 to 18%. Now women are funded at about 50-50 with their male colleagues in the program. Indigenous scholarship has risen from, I should actually look at my notes and pull out the actual, I had that down here, has risen from less than 1% of the budget, which was much smaller. It was 900,000, and now we're at between 6 and 8 million, depending on who my section head is. Approximately 30% of that budget goes to Indigenous scholarship, which others can define probably better than I, but I define it as Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations being funded themselves to do scholarship, Indigenous scholars as PIs, co-PIs, Indigenous students as strong participation in research projects, and also as non-Indigenous researchers working in a community collaborative process with Indigenous scholars. We have over 26 currently active projects in the Arctic Social Science program out of, I think, 100 that promote, that are doing Indigenous science and scholarships. So I actually am very proud of that number. And we'd like to see it increase. We'd like to see it go. I have, one of Anna's master plans is to have a whole solicitation, or at least a Dear Colleague letter soliciting Indigenous scholarship in this program. It would be nice to have an Indigenous scholarship program. We have the Tribal Colleges and Universities program, but that has very different goals from actually soliciting Indigenous scholarship. And I'm hoping that we can be a catalyst. That's one of the things. When I say I plan, that this has been Anna's plan, my boss, Simon Stevenson, soon to be my boss again, said, well, it's not totally your plan. Every time you had a panel, every time you read those proposals, every time you spoke with a researcher, you adjusted the program to fit. I think one of the things that's going to be of benefit, and one of the reasons why I didn't make all of these workshops, even though I pushed everybody to try this, all of these workshops before the next solicitation, is that we're going to have a lean, mean solicitation, as they call it, and then the websites are going to be sort of the breadth and depth of the program and what types of research and interests that the program has, and that will be much more easily updated. Solicitations are a complex process of sign-off, but websites, I and my direct boss have control over, so we may do more in Dear Colleagues letters, which basically solicits, which is an easier way than changing the entire solicitation for soliciting specific types of research. And the website itself can be updated and changed as these workshops go along and we find out. what's happening. Another thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be data mining the declines, because I need to know, are there things that the community, are there concepts that are being declined, that are coming out of the decline proposals that we need to be thinking about. We tell people, look at the awards and the awards database and look at what the program is funding, but I'm interested in what we're not funding. Are there themes that are not getting funded? And does that mean that we need some research coordination networks? We need some workshops to help develop these themes that are coming out in the declines. Why are these proposals being declined if indeed we are declining whole concepts and whole themes in the program? I want to know that. And that's another thing that the Jefferson Institute is going to be doing for me, is mining the project summaries, because otherwise it's too much of a job for me to clean all the private data. So they're going to be mining the project summaries, which I think is probably a pretty good base of data to find out what I'm declining.
Anna, we have another question.
Let's see. Oh, the mic is on. Hi, Anna. It's Jay Johnson. So you were talking about research methods with indigenous communities, and I was just wondering, in fact, I sent you an email right as you were saying that. What about holding one of the workshops next year that you were mentioning specifically on that topic? Because there's been very little exploration. You know, there's been a lot of talk over the last decade, a little bit longer, on indigenous methodologies. We talk about it broadly, but no one's really talking about the methods specifically, what's working, what's not working, and how various methods can be adapted to work better in indigenous communities.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous idea. Stacy Rasmus and Olga Ultergesheva have been working on, what would an indigenous methodology look like? Graham Hingangaroa Smith was at the Fairbanks workshop, and I was gonna tell everybody at this workshop, if you're not familiar with his work and with Linda Smith's work, which obviously Jay is very familiar, he gave he was just inspirational about not only decolonizing scientific theory and methods, but decolonizing educational systems, institutional change that needs to occur in order to decolonize the very systems through which we work. And that speaks to me because if you've ever been a panelist, I give an implicit bias training at NSF panels, and I hope all of you, I always say, the good news is I know who you are now, and the bad news is I know who you are. So you're all going to be expected to produce reviews and sit on panels, which can be an amazing amount of work, but now I know who you are. So it was an amazing discussion with Dr. Smith. I don't know if you all are familiar with what's going on in New Zealand. It is transformational. Transforming higher education with the recognition, not just the cumulative disadvantage that was occurring for Maori people, but also rethinking the way in which we, in the academy, we're not just talking, we have some of this in charter schools and in other mechanisms, very little, but we have some bilingual schools, et cetera. But in the academy, it's unheard of to think about how we learn. And we all know, most of us are social scientists, we all know that, that the academy is culturally constructed. It is a socially constructed institution that reproduces itself. And it is no surprise that we talk a lot about economic and social disadvantage being a barrier to Indigenous people participating in the academy, but that's not the only thing. The academy is a highly colonialized and colonizing institution. And so we need to think, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just need to talk about it. We need to think about how to decolonize the institution itself. And that's a whole nother workshop, and many workshops, probably in RCM. But yeah, Jay, I think that's a great idea. We do need to talk about, you're working in that area. Renee Puolani Puolani Lewis has a project where she's looking at what's the capacity for institutions to do this kind of work. And as I said, Olga and Stacy, and then the work going on in New Zealand, and I have to say there's a lot more going on that I'm not aware of, but it's not nearly enough. And so if social sciences can be a bit of a catalyst and provide some funds for workshops and more research coordination networks to discuss that, then great. I think that's wonderful, and I'll expect your proposal when we put out that Dear Colleague letter for the next group of workshops in 2017, 2018.
So I have a real question now, Anna. Your discussion of interdisciplinarity and bringing the humanities in, so what would that look like in terms of a Dear Colleague letter or call for proposals where actually you are, through Arctic Social Sciences, soliciting people to bring the humanities in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I don't know what it would look like. I can fantasize and think about what it would look like, encouraging that interdisciplinarity. I think you can do it now. I fund those kinds of research projects now. I don't know if you're familiar with Sveta Yamin-Pasternak and Igor Pasternak's work. Igor is an artist, a fine artist. He's a very talented artist. And Sveta is an anthropologist, and they work together in that his lens as an artist, he goes into the field with her and they work very closely. And then their community that they're working with, there was a wonderful project with the Delta Russian population in Delta, Alaska. There's a large Russian community. And so they were looking at migration into Alaska and how that community developed and what it looked like. And they were very involved in artisanal, I guess, artisanal gardening would be the best way to call it and to label it, and fishing, of course, and hunting. And he did an art exhibit of their, of canning, which was very cutting edge, not only for artists, but also the visualization of that. And it's on the web and it's wonderful. And of course, many people brought memories back to their grandmother's basements. It did my own, or their cellars where you have all those beautiful jars and canning. But Igor's point is that art is process. Social systems are a process. And culture is a process. And so he really brought in the idea of the processualness, if you can call it that, and I'm an anthropologist, we love to invent words, the processualness of, human society and culture, people, and the way in which we interact with our world and of art itself. And so that's a marvelous example, and you can contact, I can give you Sveta's information if you want to look at what they produced and how they work together. Now they have a unique, obviously they're husband and wife, they have a unique relationship, and so they feed very closely into each other's thinking. How you would work with someone who is an artist. I think there are many ways methodologically that you could be in the field together and work together. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Mary Beth's work on gender and cultural production through handicrafts or through women's labor in sewing and producing. I could see a wonderful project there, working with someone who is the artist themselves, producing these beautiful artworks, and Mary Beth working with that person and talking with different women who are working together about the issues of gender and culture and production and how that all fits together. I think working very closely with an artist would almost be a must in a project like that. And I just think it's important because art speaks to us as human beings. whether it's music, whether it's, paintings, whether it's quilts or beaded artwork. We've talked about a lot of that as anthropologists as form and function, the functionality of beauty. But I think we need to also stretch ourselves and talk about concepts of beauty and concepts of art and how producing culture, producing art. I mean, you all are more familiar with those theories than I am. I think it's important, and I think if you're going to understand holistically the whole system in the Arctic, which everybody keeps talking about, we have to understand the system. You can't understand the people who live in an environment in the Arctic. They don't separate art and environment and animals and people in the way that most, or I don't know of any, I'm not that familiar with the French and the Spanish and all the different cultures that form the Western viewpoint. But by and large, we're very compartmentalized. And I think in order to understand a world that's not so compartmentalized, we need to include the humanities.
Thank you, Anna. We have one last question. We have like 3 minutes for it, so.
Okay, thank you, Anna. This follows on that idea of making connections. Increasingly, we're seeing many different projects, social sciences projects, connecting to other disciplines and other funding agencies even. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on ideas of how we connect the social sciences and humanities to disciplines like ecology, for example, we're working under the Endangered Languages Program. We're working now with permafrost scientists, not only within NSF funding, but we have grants now with NASA, with NOAA. We're working under IARPC in the US, but internationally under SAON and IASC. So what are your thoughts on maybe a workshop or some sort of initiative on how we connect to those broader initiatives?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's not easy, as you know, Peter. It's difficult. It's not easy. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, and when I think of interdisciplinarity, I think of you all. I mean, primarily social scientists. I keep explaining to people that interdisciplinary science can be all social scientists. Social science isn't a discipline. But usually people are thinking about, the sustainability stool, the social, the environmental, and the engineering of sustainability. And so they want that kind of interdisciplinarity. It's difficult. And I don't think one workshop, I think we probably need to think about something like an ideas lab. I'm not totally answering your question, Peter, but I will. Think about an ideas lab of bringing people together who are interested, at least in trying to work together, and talk about, producing some projects from that ideas lab where people can then go out and try to work together. As you all know, interdisciplinarity is very difficult. And I just have to share one of my stories of working with, first, Peter, yes, that kind of a workshop would be great. Maybe bringing all the different funding people together with scholars to talk about how can we do this. It's not easy. Interagency funding, documenting endangered languages program at NSF and NEH is the most successful one that I've been involved in. The Belmont Forum was another one that was very successful, I thought, and I'll let Andre tell you all over dinner what that was about. So that was international. One of the best things that ever happened to me was participating with the European Science Union, which the EU got rid of by and large, the European Science Union and the Boreas project at the very beginning, because it made me recognize how diverse the Arctic is, how international it is, and how networking is important. These kinds of workshops and networking opportunities are huge. So that's very, very important, but interdisciplinarity is difficult. Here's the story I was going to tell. I was sitting with one of my colleagues, and I tell my colleagues all the time that the natural world is socially constructed, and they get this look like deers in the headlights on their face, like, oh my God, what is she talking about? Did you understand what she said? And so I was sitting with one of my colleagues, and he was at the time, he's no longer here, so you can't blame any one of my colleagues sitting with me now, but working in the ARC System Science, which is about system science, and they were writing a new solicitation and wanted to know if we should call it human dimensions or should we call it social science. And I said, well, let's talk about it, because to me, human dimensions research is a very limited piece of social science of, that direct interaction of how human beings are affecting the natural environment. They're not really interested in all the complexities of social, political, cultural, economic systems over here. They're interested in this. And so I said, tell me what you want to do. And at the end of the discussion, I said, yeah, I think you really should just use the word human dimensions. You're really not interested in social science as part of this system. And he looked at me and he goes, wow, Anna, you really think that human beings are fundamentally different from other primates. And I said, wow, the reason you can ask me that question, say that, is because human beings are fundamentally different from other primates. So we have a long road just in that very basic interdisciplinarity, speaking completely different languages. I understood where he was coming from. He just sees human beings as massively more destructive creatures on the planet. But as social scientists, we know that that's like not even 1/100th of the whole perspective of what's going on. And so that's my short example as to why it can be very difficult to do interdisciplinary research, because you're going to spend a year just trying to figure out where each other's coming from. So yes, more workshops on that, no question. If we're going to demand it, we need to figure out how to make it productive.
Thank you, Anna, very much. Well, of course, you're not leaving us, right? You will be here with us, and as I was saying, watching, and I'm sure as the program goes along, we will invoke you back onto the big screen and continue our discussion, questioning. But thank you very much for your very energizing introduction. So we have the charge now. Basically, we feel the importance of what we do for the generation, I guess 1 or 2 to come, right? I'm supposed to be a generation that grew up on what they did in 1999, right? I mean, that's how it is. And that is give me a distinct pleasure to welcome our first keynote speaker, who actually was on the group that developed the 1999 document that you all read. It's Peter Schweitzer, who is a university professor of anthropology at University of Vienna, and also emeritus professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he's a past president of the International Arctic Science Association. I'm sure he is also a founding member of that organization, no? Okay, well, I guess not. But I guess Peter will talk to us about development of Arctic social sciences throughout his wonderful career.
Thank you very much, Andre, and thank you very much, Anne, and the team, the wonderful team that has put this event together. And I think already now we understand that it was worth our trouble of coming here. I say these words because I'm a slightly reluctant keynote speaker for 2 reasons. When Andre initially contacted me, I had really a scheduling conflict. I had no time to come here. But then at the same time, who has time? Nobody has time of us. So I kind of worked around that and made it somehow work. The other thing was also that I felt, in a forum like this, where we come together and we all have stories to tell, we need to talk to each other. And it's not so much about me or anyone else lecturing to the rest of the group. So it's one of the reasons that I try to keep it on one level personal, so as the title indicates. At the same time, I have a couple of slides here, probably about 30 minutes, and hopefully it will be not too monologuous and boring. But let's move on. For me, it starts here. So when I basically was in graduate school, or the equivalent of that, in Vienna, Austria. So I was in around 85, 86, I got started working on a PhD project that was located in Siberia, but it had really nothing to do with the Arctic, because I didn't even know that the Arctic existed. It really had to do for me from a purely theoretical perspective. I was interested in hunter-gatherer societies. And I realized that there was a niche, there was actually, there was a gap. You know, people talked about Africa and Asia and Australia, but nobody talked about Siberia. And so for me, the drive to kind of do a historical ethnography or ethnohistory of Siberian hunter-gatherers was a kind of, really had nothing to do with Arctic research. And so as a regional focus, I certainly wouldn't have seen myself in the 1980s as an Arctic scholar. Also, part of the area that I was working on was in Chukotka, so definitely north of the tree line. There is also another important issue I think that we need to, when I think back of the 1980s, is this kind of dividing line that, as you see on this slide, went through the middle of Europe, but I think also to a certain degree went through the middle of our heads in terms of this bipolar world, the so-called Cold War, and that's how Europe looked politically at the point, on the right-hand side, the red-colored, the Eastern Bloc, or however it was referred to, which was also the Warsaw Pact states. Austria, by the way, is in gray as a neutral country, but just on the borderline. And I think that's up to the present day. Austrians are very sad about the sanctions against Russia because they always want to trade with Russia. They are close, but it also gave me the opportunities in the 1980s to travel to Russia and do research there, probably easier than for some other people. So this slide, just a quick summary of what I would like to do now, the next 20 minutes or so. It's not just, I want to tell about a few episodes of Arctic social sciences as I recollected. At the same time, I'm a cultural anthropologist, I'm an oral historian, so I know that, we construct the past very much in telling them, as any kind of history does. So I will try to kind of bring in also some other sources where appropriate. But at the end, at least, of the talk, I want to get to the point where are we today, and how can we move forward? That's certainly, I think, what stimulates these discussions and these workshops. So let me go back to Vienna 1989. So I was just about, that was actually the year that I submitted my PhD dissertation for review by my professor, which then took 7 months, which was the usual thing to happen in Vienna. If you were lucky, if your professor looked at it within 7 months. So I already, the bullet point, you already saw that. It just, there was no Arctic science for me in existence, or if it had existed, it had something to do with the natural sciences. I was aware of kind of publications about the Arctic that came from the natural world, and I think it was for natural scientists much easier during the period of the Cold War to imagine a unified circumpolar North, because the plants and animals and other elements of the so-called natural environment, they were the same despite political influences. So I think it was especially for social scientists much more difficult to imagine a kind of a circumpolar or Arctic universe there on the social or political end. But at the same time, while I also would like to point out here that while I in 1989 was completely ignorant of some of these trends, they were there. In the 1980s, some of that came to fruition in the 1990s was happening. probably just to throw in one important event was the so-called Arctic Conference in Leningrad in 1988 that really laid the groundwork for a number of developments, including the foundation of IASC in 1990. And there were a number of other important meetings going on behind the scenes, because after all, these were already the perestroika years of Gorbachev. And so, especially in the second half of the 1980s, there were developments going on, but it had not risen to the surface yet. So, but important, I think, that our natural science colleagues had a slightly different view of the Arctic. They, of course, were facing similar political problems of access, etc. But even we in the social science community had some materials at hand. You know, this very important and interesting book from 1978 by three main authors, and you know, one of them being from Alaska, and Terence Armstrong from the Scott Polar Research Institute. This book had been around for 10 years at the time when I was finishing my dissertation, but nevertheless it didn't, and I think I already owned it at the time. I had looked at it definitely, but it didn't really influence my thinking that much. There were also other things that had been in existence. They had, for example, the journal Arctic Anthropology. You know, if you want, there was a whole journal devoted to some aspects of Arctic social sciences. And that might be a side discussion. There's a number of archaeologists here in the room. That Arctic anthropology was, of course, driven by one man, by Chester Chart, at Madison, Wisconsin, and his vision of the field, and it was very much driven by archaeology in its first years and decades. But nevertheless, so you see already here that my narrative is partially also kind of characterized by ignorance. It's not so. There were definitely developments happening. Well, I would say the journal Arctic, that had been around for even longer, of course, was at that time definitely almost exclusively defined by the natural sciences, and to a certain degree continues to do so. So after I finished my PhD, then finally in 1990 in Vienna, I had the same problem like many other PhDs in anthropology at the time in Austria. I was looking for a job. You know, there were no jobs in Austria, and so I was extremely lucky in 1991 to be offered a one-year visiting position in Fairbanks. And I thought, wow, great. You know, I go there for a year and go home, and it will be really enriching, and it will be interesting. And it turned out to be 22 years in the end. And it was, you know, at the time I didn't realize it, but it was certainly, when I came in 1991, it was a time when when really the Arctic social sciences, as we know them today, in the United States, were being created. Actually, it was the year before I came, in 1990, that the foundation of IASA, the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, happened in Fairbanks. It was during one of the Inuit Studies conferences, and I had a slide in there of Ludger Müller-Wille, one of the founding fathers. I just threw it out then, but I had already too many slides. And actually, he was, during that first year that I was in Fairbanks, he was there as on a visiting assignment, and you know, he talked to me about the importance of IASA, about the, you know, and the upcoming first conference, the first ICAS, which then happened to be in 1992 in Quebec City. So, but the foundation of IASA was not a singular event. The other organization, IASC, was created around the same time. I think it's important to keep in mind that these two sister or brother organizations are, you know, they developed in parallel, but they're very different in a way. One is top-down, for better or for worse, but also richer because it's top-down, it's countries, so that's IASC. And then you have the poor brother or sister, IASA, many of us are members of, and which is a grassroots member organization, but I think both have had their interesting developments in the last 25 years. The NSF Arctic Social Science Program was founded at that time. I have so far seen or heard at least 3 different founding dates. Anna just said 1990. I think it was decided in 1989 that it would be happening, and I think it became operational in 1991. So I put all these 3 dates on there. I'm not really sure which one the actual is, and certainly in the early 90s, it was not just the works of people that we already mentioned, but also Oren Young, Gail Osherenko, and others who had been working hard on this idea of the Arctic as a social science unit for us, to think about. A younger self, just throw in one of my first larger research projects, which was situated in the Bering Strait region. So part of the research was in Chukotka on the Russian side, and part of it was in northwest Alaska on the Seward Peninsula. And for me, this continues to be one of the most fascinating parts of the world of the Arctic up to the present day, because these crossroads of continents, to cite an important project of the time by Fitzhugh and Kroll, is really, is so fascinating in its many different similarities and differences, and part of which are, of course, political. I want to move on to this event that Andrea already mentioned. So I'm one of 3 people in the room, I believe, who were there. Please let me know if I missed someone. So Gail Fondel, Herb Maschner, and myself, to my knowledge, were the 3 people who were participants at that workshop and who are here now. This is the full list of participants. So the workshop happened in 1997. The report then was published in 1999, so 1.5 years later, and I have it here if we want to peruse that also in the following days. So for me personally, it was I actually had at that point, I had been involved in some larger research projects, but actually none of them funded by NSF. And it was an extremely helpful event for me as a learning event, to be surrounded by a number of really eminent senior scholars and to be part of discussions. And that's really, now that I'm back in Europe again, I think this is one of the most important positive things of the North American tradition, is that you bring in junior scholars to the table and give them the same voice. In Europe, unfortunately, we still have often this, you need to have gray hair, white hair, whatever, before you are able to open your mouth. So that's not very helpful. And I think we need to stick to that. And I think Anna is doing a great job in always trying to recruit young people in a variety of capacities. So I think, in all of us who were there at the workshop can find bits and pieces where we try to throw in our own visions in there. I think it's not really my job here to go into detail and to look at what we suggested then and what really happened. But definitely it became an official document that served as a guideline for a number of years. Actually, I think I learned a lot at that meeting and a number of other NSF activities, such as reviewing and things like that, then starting in the late 90s, I then was able to have a number of NSF grants myself, which had to do with things like reindeer herding, for example, or mixed identities and northeastern Siberian things. But one thing that I also would like to mention, and I'm very happy that Anna already mentioned it, is the Boreas initiative, because I think it really was different. And so this was by the initiated by the European Science Foundation, which no longer exists. You could say it was closed because it was too successful. No, it was closed because it's a complicated thing to do anything in Europe together, because you have these different country funding agencies. Anyhow, so the European Science Foundation had a wonderful program called the EuroCourse project, or the EuroCourse program, which was actually in the division of humanities. And that's so interesting, you know, how each country, the world kind of forces you also how to define yourself. I think my own research, I could define part of it as part of the humanities. I mentioned oral history research. You know, that perfectly fine fits into any definition of the humanities. In the United States, of course, I very early on realized that if I would define myself as a humanities scholar, I wouldn't get any money anywhere. So becoming a social scientist was also a pragmatic decision in a way of being able to go to NSF. In the European context of the European Science Foundation, it was actually the other way around. We were forced to say, you know, we're doing humanities research here because it was the humanities division. And of course, I would say it was a very mixed bag of social science and probably not very much humanities research. Also, there were a number of historians part of it. Here he listed the different funding agencies. So the program, so Boreas, the short form is not really an acronym. Boreas stands, so the long version is Histories from the North, Environments, Movements, and Narratives. So these were the key topics. And I have here listed the 7 projects that were funded, actually in the end, by Boreas. So it was a complicated process, and Anna can even tell us more about that. She was on the reviewing and funding end, so in the end, these complex projects had to be funded by individual national research agencies, but they were reviewed internationally, and you know, there were a number of different countries present there, European countries plus Canada, plus the USA, and Russia. Also, Russia didn't put in money. So my own project that I led was called Move by the State, had to do with issues of relocation and resettlement. In the North, we have also, we have Lee Husky in the room, who led the project Understanding Migration in the Circumpolar North. I think all of these 7 projects were extremely successful. There was a very high involvement of NSF in there, so meaning there was a very high involvement of US scholars in there, and that also a very high funding involvement by the National Science Foundation. But it also showed that I think it gave the US also a possibility to see that US scholars were very competitive in an international setting concerning Arctic social sciences. So there was a lot of interdisciplinarity there, and but it was really among different social science disciplines and between social sciences and humanities. But the really innovative part was the international dimension, which you can have to a certain degree in normal NSF projects, but as you all know, there are clear limits to that. Here it was wonderful. The European Science Foundation also funded additional networking events where we were able to get together and really build up big research networks, and I think a number of them are still very active in one way or the other. I would also want to use this slide here to throw in that I think there have been in recent, unfortunately, it has never been possible so far to repeat that, and I think that would be wonderful if we could find a way, but it cannot be the US alone. It needs to be together with other countries to do something similar, to do something truly circumpolar, circumarctic, on a project level, on a funding level. And I think Anna and other people at NSF have been also trying to figure out how that could work. But there are also other big initiatives going on. For example, the RESTA project. I'm not sure, Andre, whether we will be hearing about the RESTA project in any separate event in the next few days. And many of you probably have heard about that resources and sustainable development in the Arctic, a Canadian-based project and Canadian-funded project, but it's a real big one and a lot of international participation from the US, but also European participation. But again, it's housed in one country and tries to pull in another of people. There's also a number of big European initiatives, such as the Swedish MISTRA funded thing. So they have one now running called Arctic Sustainable Development, New Governance for Sustainable Development in the European Arctic. So I think there are, and I will leave that to you then at some point, for example, tomorrow morning to mention that. The other thing definitely in my own development over the years was certainly a kind of certain trajectory toward more interdisciplinarity, not just within the social sciences and humanities, but also with the natural sciences. For me, a lot of it started with in 2003 when we were getting an award from ARCS, actually from the systems science within the polar programs. I worked there with a number of natural scientists, and it brought me for the first time into actual climate change research, and which in one way or the other I've continued since. And then I just want to mention it. From 2007 onward, until I left Fairbanks, I was very much involved with the Alaska EPSCoR program, and we were lucky enough that we were able to bring a program that historically had been more or less entirely natural science focused into a kind of an interdisciplinary program, and you see the program titles here. So we had the Resilience and Vulnerability project first, and I would say the current project, Alaska ACE, is a continuation of some of the things that had been developed before. So if I want to kind of just break down a few important steps here, these I think for the 1990s, the end of the beginning of the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, which I think it was a dual thing. In our thinking, it meant, okay, we can now, we can go broader, we can think about a circumpolar perspective, we can do actual research in Russia, for example. But it also was a kind of a very benign Arctic. So the Arctic, nobody really was particularly interested in the resources of the Arctic. So there were these ideas around, maybe the Arctic will turn into the next Antarctic, this kind of nice little zone for research and protection. So it was also this kind of not too much outside interest. I think we have early on this development of interdisciplinary research tradition, and that goes back certainly before my time. I think the Arctic, maybe often for logistical reasons, has a long tradition of doing interdisciplinary research, and more so than other parts of the world, and I think that's something that really deserves some attention. I think once climate change became a major attention grabber, and you could put ACEA probably there, so the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, as one date in 2004. I think that certainly changed a lot in Arctic research. It changed a lot for people in the Arctic, but it really changed a lot in the research community. And then, more or less at the same time or subsequent to that, you have this sudden increase in the outside interest in the Arctic, be it for economic reasons, be it for political reasons, and I think that really changed the playing field entirely. And it meant that many new actors not only came into the Arctic, but also came into Arctic research. More recently, the talk about the new Cold War, the deteriorating relations between Russia and some of the Western countries, and what that will mean for us, for example, as researchers, is a big question. Will there be again very soon a situation where we have parts of the Arctic that are non-accessible for us as researchers? And now, of course, the last couple of years, we are actually facing a drop in oil prices and other commodity prices, and we will have to see what that means to kind of international interests in the Arctic. The one thing that I didn't mention here, but I think is very important, I think for me, the 1990s and early 2000, the main thing was that Arctic social scientists developed a self-consciousness. We were no longer the poor cousins of the natural scientists, but we had a seat at the table. I think, I'm sure Anna has statistics like that we were, I think, writing bigger grants. We were no longer saying, oh, give me 20,000 and I will be happy, I will manage somewhat. But, just write a normal proposal. Just sit down and think it through, how much does your research cost. So I think that's really, for me, the main thing that really happened in these 20 years and IPY, I haven't even mentioned that yet, give us a seat at the table. At the same time, since I'm, I think, the only non-North American participant here, I really also want to point out that we must not make the mistake of seeing the Arctic too much in a North American light. Our colleague Carina Keskitalo is one of those. She's Swedish, a Swedish social scientist. She often makes the point, this is an article that she published a couple of years ago, actually in connection with the Arctic human development. Another thing I'm not really going to talk about because Gail is here and she will be talking about that tomorrow. But I think there are many researchers especially the North European North. For them, it's often difficult. Where's the Arctic? It starts somewhere closer to the North Pole, and who feel that a lot of research that is coming out of Alaska and northern Canada is kind of doesn't really reflect what is going on in the North European Arctic, and that for that matter, I think to recognize the heterogeneity of the Arctic is really an important issue. This is a NASA image, the Arctic at night. I think 2014. It measures light north of 60th latitude, and it's just one way of looking at differences. You can look at, you have a couple of Nordregio slides which show you the same thing. You see population concentrations in the Arctic and where there are more people. So you see the North European Arctic and Western Russia, or the northern part of Western Russia, being, there's lots of people, there's heavy industry. And it's also reflected, of course, in something like that, the percentage of indigenous population. So it's very uneven. So I think this thing that there was an implicit understanding, I would say, in the early 1990s, okay, now we can talk about a circumpolar north, and often we try to generalize, because there are a number of important similarities. But I think we maybe overemphasized the similarities and underestimated the differences. And so I think it is important, or it has been important the last few years, to get back to these significant differences that exist. So just the fact that all people live in the north, in the Arctic, doesn't mean that they live the same kinds of lives. And these maps are just a few indicators of the differences that exist. That's one of my current interests is in transportation infrastructure, and you see here trains and pipelines and even shipping routes, and you see again major differences in how developed parts of the North are and others are not. So what makes this difference? I have here two, if you so want, historical images. One is it's a famous Russian picture of the campaign of Yermak, kind of the start of the Siberian conquest in the 16th century, and I think the picture below is Norilsk after World War II, and so. Obviously, history in general makes a difference, but I think the differences that we see today have to do with the 20th century and have to do with different, I think, for example, if you take Norilsk, so I think the legacy of the Soviet Union and of the particular way the North was industrialized and was populated, continued to the present day. And that's just the fact that the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991 didn't make, I think in the last 25 years we have seen that many of these ideas that how things would develop have turned out to be quite different. So I think the trajectory, I think a number of these 20th century developments still continue, and I think this is another dimension, is that in terms of self-determination and political rights of indigenous peoples, there is, we have North America, including Greenland, where we have actual legal agreements and a variety from treaties to the very particular ANCSA agreement. I'm not going to go into detail here, but also Alaska, Northern Canada and Greenland have legal means for self-determination, or at least for partial self-determination, which doesn't exist in that form in other parts of the North. So it's history, institutions, and culture, if you so want. So, a couple of years ago in 2013, I came back to Vienna, and I was facing a completely different situation there. So suddenly people, when I want to do something there, it's not about the Arctic. People think, why the Arctic? Why would you want to study the Arctic? It's not self-evident, which is also good, because it means you have to explain yourself, and you have to develop an Arctic research program that is not just relevant for the Arctic. So if you say, wow, that's really exciting for Alaska to find out, why should Austria fund that? So for example, our current project that we have going on, which is situated in eastern Siberia, which is listed at the end of this slide, configurations of remoteness, it's really our argument is that it's applicable to remote regions in the world, not just in the Arctic. And the other thing is really, there is a strong, we talked a lot about indigenous participation, indigeneity in the Arctic. There is a strong hostility, I would say, in the European research community. And, I'm still struggling with that, where this is coming from. You could say some of it is maybe remnants of colonialism, maybe, in our minds. But part of it is a general distrust to kind of essentializing categories. So it's not even, if you say, ethnicity is, I want to look at the impact of ethnicity, people will try to deconstruct it and say, well, why ethnicity? It's basically a social construct. It's not relevant. And so race, ethnicity, culture, indigeneity are notions that are being deconstructed actively all the time, and while some of these notions are very actively used in the North American context. So I have to deal with that. I want, and I see that I'm actually running out of time, but I have put three larger topics together that I see as being relevant, and they're not new topics at all. So it was more kind of, okay, what I'm, from the current state of affairs, what do I see important or continuously important? And one would be human environmental relations, and on purpose I call it human environmental relations and not just climate change, because I think it's the larger, the umbrella topic that is relevant here. Climate change, is a particular issue that has contributed a lot to the fact that human environmental relations are again at the center of attention. And actually there is again a difference between Europe and North America. I think North American anthropology and many other disciplines have this long tradition of looking at human environmental relations. Anna already mentioned to us that it was one of the three priority areas at the beginning, so which comes out of this report, the 1989 report, which was the foundation for the Arctic Social Science Program. There's really, I think I will have to skip that little section here, but I personally am becoming more and more interested in the close connection between climate change and morality. And it's so much that we do, or so much that is written and said about climate and climate change in the world has to do with morality. And I find it also always interesting if you look back in time, that's not an invention of the 20th or 21st century. I think, especially extreme events, some kind of catastrophes have always been a challenge to our norms and cultural patterns, and we had to blame someone. And so I find it extremely interesting, also in the growing social science literature, how many of these treatments that I see are morality plays, and who is to blame. And I think I mentioned to Nancy last night that a lot of the European literature these days, it's about that climate change is in reality about capitalism, so which is again is a particular kind of morality play. And this little example here, which I'm not going to go through in detail, it's the Lake of Sorrow in South Tyrol in the northern part of Italy, is because there were repeated catastrophic events there, and so people constructed why that was happening. It was because the devil used to take a bath there, and that's really what happened. At the same time, these stories, these stories are being passed on to the present day. This is actually from the research done of my colleague Sophie Elixhauser. And as you can already see here, working in the Alps is really an exciting thing for an Arctic researcher coming to Rio, because there's a number of similarities there. The other issue would be the built environment, which I really think has been understudied from a social science perspective, because there was more, especially the pristine Arctic, there was always a lot of attention on the so-called natural environment. And science, technology, and infrastructure are extremely important, which also means that science and technology studies are extremely relevant here. And I already mentioned that my own work right now has to do with transportation infrastructure, and if you so want, the agency, so what it does to people and other actors in that space. Finally, identities, I think, is again is a whole section devoted to this in the 1999 report. I think it has taken on new dimensions that we didn't see back then that clearly. It's despite the fact that many of my European colleagues always want to deconstruct things like culture and ethnicity. It is being used very actively in the North and elsewhere in the world, in a variety of ways, be it as a tool, a weapon, a commodity. It always has been used as a tool, culture definitely, but I think in a much more self-conscious way these days, and I think that deserves attention. And also, who brought that up? Was it I think Anna who mentioned that what is our position toward understanding the world, and I think I'm in Vienna. I'm definitely surrounded by social constructivists, and any kind of social scientist is to a certain degree a social constructivist, but the question is, what form of extreme form. It makes it more difficult to work with natural scientists if you take an extreme form of social constructivism, but at the same time, you do not want to be a naive positivist. That's certainly not a good working thing here. I get signs from Andre that I need to wrap up here. So I'm not going to, because I think the whole, especially in Europe again, the whole ontological turn, and maybe also more specifically in anthropology, is really becoming big. So I think that's also a question, what are we going to do with that? Which to a certain degree contradicts what I just said about social constructivism, because it certainly goes in a different direction. Maybe this is something we can discuss in the next few days. I also, I'm glad to see that we will be having a data session. But and that's very important, and Peter is the man for that. But I think we also a broad thinking about data, but also methods, methodologies, and new research technology is really important. This is, of course, said by a guy who comes from a very qualitative research tradition, cultural anthropology. Many of you come from disciplines that have a much more quantitatively and much more technologically oriented research tradition. But I think that these are issues that I think we need to, because if you look at different branches of science, often technological progress is often a predecessor to scientific progress. What do I see as challenges ahead? Many people of us like the fact that we are in the limelight of attention these days, but I think that's not a given. And if we like that many parts of the non-Arctic world are interested in the Arctic, we need to, that can very quickly disappear. And I think that's something people in the Arctic and people working in the Arctic have to think about. What level of attention do we want? I see, often people use this phrase of politicization of Arctic research. I mean, in a very specific, the example for which I don't have time right now is this has a lot to do with, for example, what the Arctic Council does in terms of just, if you do not belong to an Arctic member state, you're not an Arctic researcher in their definition. So again, this is maybe things for us to talk about later. Also, what is the right balance between basic or fundamental research and applied research? Even probably the most fundamental question is, what does the Arctic need social scientists? For a very long time, we were the brokers often, the brokers between local people, between indigenous people and some outside interests, or sometimes also, I would say in the beginnings of interdisciplinary research, we were the brokers between local people and natural scientists. But I think these different parties have found their own voice. We are not needed as middlemen or middlewomen or as brokers. I think it is the real question is to what is the critical contribution that we can contribute, and I think that goes beyond a pure service function. I think we as social scientists have to be critical of what is of the developments in the Arctic, which also includes being critical of ourselves and critical of the actors with whom we work in the Arctic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Well, Peter used his time, I guess, but maybe if you have one quick question, we could do it, or maybe some comment, maybe anything related to his reflection. I don't know if Herb has a comment, or Gail on 99 product. I don't know. I think you're absolutely right.
I think you're absolutely right that one of the big things we learned since those early days is that there is no natural environment in the Arctic without people in it. That the entire Arctic is engineered by humans, and you have to think about human ecosystem engineering, whether it be global climate change or down to local kinds of things. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things is the whole built built environment phenomena. But the other thing we learned too, and like as you pointed out, the positivism versus social scientists, is that we found out, all of us working with ecologists, is ecologists would rather publish a high R-squared even if they know they have the wrong answer, while anthropologists would rather be right even if we couldn't prove it statistically. And it created some interesting dynamics for all of us, but it ties in directly with your perspective there, and I agree, very nice.
Thank you, Herb.
Okay, well, so we actually need to be sticking to the schedule, hopefully. So I guess we'll say thanks again to Peter for very.
Actually, let me see one slide, because the last slide I didn't show, my thank you slide, but I also want to mention that, that's Norma Cassi. You know her, a number of people know her, and it's when I put that in, I thought, what is actually the message here? Often it's just, it's a nice slide, but I think it is actually, Norma gave that to me with the specific, say, use it, basically tell our story, and it's the story of a lake that was named after her aunt and which dried up. It's one of the effects of climate change, if you so want. One of the effects of climate change, if you so want, in the Yukon where she lives, and a local person who very consciously, it's a professionally taken photograph, and I think that also adds to its power. And it's not, the image is not here to see this poor old woman here in the middle of the dried out lake, but look at this very bright northern resident who very consciously uses something that is happening around her to make a point and to speak to the rest of the world.
Okay, so now let me do a quick preview of what happens next. So we had an inspirational charge from Anna, and then Peter sort of provided the reflection on his years. I'm sure all of us have that. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I really asked Peter to do it because, for me, I woke up as a scientist, I guess, Arctic scientist in 2007. So whatever was before that, it's kind of blurry. So it's very interesting because when we have, and we have a lot of people from mid or young generation here, which is a purpose to invite them here to kind of make the dots connected. I think it's very important. So next, of course, is our primary work, starts now. And that would be the stable discussion. So we have a break until, where is my... So there's a short break, and what we try to do, we try to expand, so try to not to have tight times, right? So we have 20 minutes, well, 10:30, I guess, we will start with our questions. Now we have an hour and 30 minutes per each group discussion, right? I think in Portland we had 45 minutes, is that what it was, Mike? Yeah, so people will say, oh, it's not enough time. So I said, okay, well, let's do an hour and a half. Maybe it's too much time, we'll see. But then will be time for you to drink coffee and stuff like that. So what I would think we should do is give 45 minutes for table discussions and 45 minutes for reporting. By reporting, I mean, so every group will stand up and tell what you guys came up with based on the questions. So we're going to video record your reporting, so remember that. So what I would like really, though, ask every group to do, and it's not easy, and I understand that that's sort of an unfortunate thing, but each group, when you sit down at the table and kind of introduce each other and kind of start your discussion, if you could please appoint a person who is going to report and, most unfortunately, who is going to take some notes. Because, we were thinking of various ways to do that. I mean, I want to put a student in each group and the student will be just typing, but I think it's more useful when actually a faculty member or at least somebody who is from the Arctic, not just a student who is assigned to do that, because you feel the discussion better than just external typewriter person. So I would like to ask every group to point, and hopefully going to be rotating, right? And then you just simply send it to me, and we will keep it as a record. If you want to write it down, it's fine too. If you could type it later or even give us written notes, but if you could just in the evening just type it up. We don't need detailed notes, just basic things, because when group reports, doesn't necessarily everything is kind of being made available, and we would like, as Anna said, we would like to have other things that may not end up in the main discussion kind of be also pronounced. So if you could do that for us, it would be wonderful. So we would keep the full record of what's going on. So that's the idea. So then I think, please, yes, Mike. Mike, do the microphone. Mike is the most experienced organizer of this workshop, so.
So I saw some eyebrows raised when Andre mentioned that we were going to be videotaping. Just as a follow-up to that, part of the way we're documenting all of this for Arctic Horizons is that we're going to generate transcripts from the audio and videotaping so that we can actually have a detailed record of what transpired. And it's really, really crucially important that we get the table notes, because what happened in Portland, and I imagine will probably happen here, is Table 2 got up and said, well, yeah, kind of what Table 1 said, and then a few other things. And then Table 3 got up and said, well, basically what Table 1 and Table 2 said, but a few other things. And it's really hard, well, impossible to quantify the degree to which those things were repeated at any given table. So Aaron Presnall is going to be going through all the transcripts and basically doing, my limited understanding is he's generally going to be creating word clouds of what topics were repeated over and over and over again, and try to quantify the degree to which those important things rose to the surface. And one final thing, when each reporter stands up, especially for Anna, who can't necessarily see us, please state your name so that she knows who's speaking, and you don't need to tell us what table you're at, but it just helps everything flow better, and it makes it easier for all the documentation.
Yep.
So now I don't want to stand between you and coffee and break, so that'll be it.
So 10:30, I guess we have 10 minutes. Thank you.